All right, guys, welcome to Coach's Corner, the Own It Coach's Corner. And we're going to be addressing different health and wellness topics on this channel, really kind of getting you guys more engaged in some deeper metrics and how to apply them to what we're using. Because again, if we're using wearables, if we're using different pieces of technology and we don't know what we're looking at, what is the benefit to us? And so when we come back and we actually get to the root of it, it's the application of the knowledge that we gain that really truly matters. And today it's all about HRV. So let's get into it. What we want to figure out here is what actually is HRV? Like, what does it mean? What metric is it? What are we actually looking at? And so if we take a look, we've all seen this before. This is an EKG. Hey, we all know the Grey's Anatomy where we have that patient laying in there and we hear that beep, beep. And then when it flatlines straight across, beep, we've lost them. It's too late. And so anyways, those high beeps are what we call the R wave, okay, through a heart rate curve. So we've got these high peaks on a typical heart rate curve, and this is your R wave. And by knowing that that's the R wave, we can understand now that there's a difference in time between these. So say, for example, it was 600 milliseconds between beat 1 and beat 2. And the next one was 710 milliseconds. And the next one was 820 milliseconds. And then the next one was 610 milliseconds. Well, what we would do to create HRV is we look at the difference between each one of these. So right in here, the difference is 110 milliseconds. The difference here is 110 milliseconds. The difference here is actually 210 milliseconds. So now what we would do is we would average this. And it's a little bit more complicated, but it takes like the square root of the actual number, and that's what it ends up being. But if we average it, we can come out and it gives us a number about 162 milliseconds. And that is equivalent to our HRV. Now, these numbers aren't anybody's data, but it's just how we figure it out. So if you're looking at your wearable and it says you are 67 HRV, that means this number right here, the average between all of your beats throughout the day on a 24-hour period, which ends up being your HRV. Now, the best way to measure HRV is at a resting state. And so this is what you have to look at with your wearable. You have to make sure that it's pulling your HRV from the time in which you're sleeping. And the best time to get it is during your slow wave sleep, which is the deepest form of sleep that you're going to have. It's that deep, physically restorative sleep that we have. Okay? So when we take a look at what our HRV is and what our HRV score is for the day, it's typically pulled from our slow wave sleep. And it is that number right there, taking a look at the time and difference between those beats, okay? The time metric that is there. So the greater the variability, the better it is for our body. And we're going to get into why. Because ultimately, we know that our heart rate is ultimately affected by our autonomic nervous system, which is things that happen involuntarily. And so we know that our nervous system has an effect on our HRV. And so there's two types of nervous systems that we need to be aware of. One is the parasympathetic. Sympathetic. Spelling, it's tough. And the other is the sympathetic. Now, I know what we're thinking. Sympathetic, oh, that must be nice, kind, easy, light. Parasympathetic must be the opposite of that. Forget that. Forget that. Parasympathetic is when our heartbeat, that's a nice heart in the middle, is beating slowly, okay? This otherwise is known as like the rest and digest stage, like the nice, slow, relaxed, calm, collected. That's our parasympathetic nervous system. Now our sympathetic nervous system, our heart is beating rapidly. Now, with a rapidly beating heartbeat, that's that fight or flight. That's like go, go, go. That's quick, 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 and fast action. So in understanding that we have these two systems, when the parasympathetic is more dominant over the sympathetic, that means that we are going to be, again, a little bit more relaxed. The variability is going to be greater because our heart is beating slower. And thus, if our heart is beating quicker, no matter what, our HRV is going to be depressed. It's going to be a lower number. Now, fitness is not the only thing that can affect this. It can be affected by a multitude of different things, and we're going to get into those factors here at the bottom. But I know a lot of people say, well, what should my HRV be? What's a good number? And the thing is it's so individualized. It's such an individualized number, but there are general trends. Typically for a 20 to 25-year-old in that stage, general health, you're going to be looking at 65 to 105 as a beats per minute. And then a 60 to 65-year-old range, you're going to be looking somewhere in that 25 to 40 range. And then anywhere along here, through that whole age bracket and 65 plus, you're going to be somewhere in that range. So again, it's a highly individualized number, guys. You cannot pinpoint it and say, if you're 30 years old, this is what you should aim for. If you're 60 years old, this is what you should aim for. These are just general trends and are going to be affected by our genetics, are going to be affected by our fitness level, are going to be affected by the stress that's going on in our life. All of these other aspects that truly end up giving us this long-term number that we need to be aware of. Now, do not be alarmed or worried about an acute number. And what I mean by acute is not cute like me, but acute in terms of at the very moment. And so what I want you to think about is long-term. Think about at least 3 to 4 days worth of data. You want 3 to 4 days worth of data because you can start to create a trend. Now, if you start to see a continual trend line downwards of HRV, that's going to be a big indicator that there's something going on. And it's going to be affected by one of the factors. It could be that your immune system is being attacked by something. It could be that you aren't sleeping well. It could be that you have added stress in something. It could be that you've added a new stimulus in your training. It could be that you're dehydrated or not being engaging in the proper nutrition factors. So these are all things we need to be aware of and be thinking of and be cognizant of when looking at our HRV. Now, once we get that trend line going for HRV, we're going to see that it goes up and down, and it's very, very effective. It's very individualized, very specific, and very touchy. And that is why it's such a key metric, because it's all about you. It doesn't matter about me. It doesn't matter about anybody else, but it's a very individualized metric towards you. Now, by understanding that, there are different factors that come into play. All right, so those factors, we have 3 of them: training, lifestyle, and biological. Now, under training, we have volume, we have intensity, we have new stimulus, and we have rest to work days. Volume is the addition of anything. It's more reps, it's more miles, it's more time. So that's what volume looks like. Versus intensity, which is increase in speed, decrease in rest periods, increase in weight lifted. And then new stimulus is if you're adding in something that you haven't done before. Maybe you're adding in a CrossFit, maybe you're adding in a group class, maybe you're adding in a new running route, so adding some hills or some sprints. That's something that your body isn't used to, so thus it's going to take it a little bit harder, a little bit longer to recover. And then the last one is rest versus work days. So if you add in an extra work day to your week, so say it be 5 days you're working out of 7, and then you add a 6th day in there, that is going to have an effect on your HRV. And you may generally see a downward trend when that happens, but then you're going to come up and see that leveling out factor again because your body adapts to it. Your body is smart. It's brilliant. And we're going to get into one where we talk about functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, maintenance, and then restorative periods. That's going to be a little bit further on in the teaching sequence, but that's the effect that can have on it. Okay? Now when we get into lifestyle, diet, hydration, alcohol, stress, and sleep, okay? So why would our diet and hydration have an effect? Well, our body is made up of 70% water. Our brain, our heart, and our lungs are made up of about 85% water. So if we're dehydrated, think about how much harder our brain has to work, why our heart rate starts to elevate, and why our lungs are no longer, again, breathing at a lower respiration rate. So hydration has a major influencer and is ultimately shown to us by that drop in HRV. Alcohol will do the same thing. It's going to drive an upward trend in that HRV. Stress is going to have a major influence on whether our HRV is depressed or whether it's elevated. Because again, going back to that nervous system, it is going to stimulate, stress stimulates that sympathetic nervous system side. And if we don't have a balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, we get into what's called this chronic overload of the sympathetic nervous system. And it's going to drive the HRV downwards. So stress is a big one. And then circadian rhythm as well as sleep. And we're going to have a whole teaching period on sleep and circadian rhythm. But if we're not getting proper sleep, if we're not getting adequate sleep, if we're not getting deep sleeps, that slow wave sleep that I talked about, that physically restorative, the REM sleep, the mentally restorative, we are going to see a decrease in that HRV as well. So lifestyle factors and training are two things that have a big influence, but the third is also biological. And what that biological looks like is your age, your gender, health conditions, and your genetics. So your age, obviously we saw just a little bit previously on the previous slide here, was that the older we get, the more depressed that HRV is going to get. And that's just a biological thing that happens with age, but we can start to prevent that through focusing on HRV 1 and 2. Same thing with gender. Just typically, males have a higher HRV than females. Just how it is. Not a big deal, but again, that is why it's such a highly individualized metric that means something to you and really nobody else. Health conditions such as respiratory issues, chronic illnesses, diseases that will trigger a big influence in a variation of heart rate and thus a variation of HRV. So if we have congenital heart disorder or a respiratory disease that causes us to have a naturally elevated heart rate, then thus we're going to have a naturally lower HRV. It's just how it is. And so these are all things that we can, again, think about as we get into this. And then obviously, if, again, working with Own It, we always do a DNA genetic test on every single one of our clients. Why? Because genetics has such a big influence in what goes on in inside our bodies, from HRV to heart rate to all of these other factors. We need to know what is going on, and thus we can put this puzzle together. Because as you see, if we see a decreased HRV, it doesn't mean that we're overtraining and we have to stop training. It doesn't mean that we're not getting good sleep. It doesn't mean that we're stressed out. It doesn't mean that we have a chronic illness. It could be a multitude of factors that we have to start putting the pieces in place to, but it all starts with awareness. And the moment we're aware of what's going on is the moment we can take into our own hands the ideas of what's going on and create the change that's necessary. So thus, we're obviously going to say, well, Justin, this is great. How do I improve my HRV? Great question. So one, if we look at the factors, is training. And we can train intelligently. We can train with balanced work to rest days. We can continually add new stimuli, not all at once, but over the course of time with phases, maybe once every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, depending on what the data tells us. Adding volume and intensity in a chronological, slowly additional scale, okay? Number 2 is making sure we're adequately hydrated. Half our body weight in ounces every single day, non-negotiable. Not an if, and, or but. Big but. Alcohol, limiting our alcohol intake. I mean, as everybody, I love alcohol. I'm a big wino, but do it in moderation and you pick and choose your spots. I try not to have alcohol when I'm stressed out. I try not to have alcohol when I need a good night's sleep. I pick and choose when I'm going to utilize it. Making sure that our sleep hygiene is great, that we're in a cold room, that it's dark, that it's quiet. Maybe we have some type of white noise in the background, that we're stimulating our parasympathetic before we go to bed through some type of meditation, stretching, hot shower, journaling, something of that nature that's going to help us get into that stage. And then from a diet standpoint, making sure, again, I have this 3-2-1 rule of making sure that we're not eating 3 hours before we go to bed, to allow, again, our body to eliminate any type of focus on digestion or interrupting and stimulating that sympathetic nervous system again. And then obviously the one that's just most common sense is just awareness. The more aware we can be of what our body's going through, the better we can make any type of changes to this. All right, guys, now I want to talk about a little bit what happens when you do actually change that stimulus. What happens when you do actually create a new stimulus on the body? What are you supposed to do? Well, there's what happens naturally, is our HRV, say it's starting right here, and this is the inflection point that we start increasing more mileage, or we add in a CrossFit, or we add in an extra day. It's going to have a negative effect on that HRV. It's going to have a decreased stress impact because, again, our body is breaking down in physical ways as well as mental ways, that thus our body is going to have to start to work harder to recover from. But what's going to start to happen is there's always this influx, which is called the supercompensation phase. And that supercompensation phase will thus allow us to take on that strain again in a different way. So now, as we recover back over baseline, the HRV continues to go up. This is HRV on this side. If we were to put the same stimulus back on us right here, we wouldn't see the dip come as low as it was before. Maybe the dip only comes to here, and then it comes back up. And then the next time we did it, it actually wouldn't have an effect on us. And thus we need to increase that intensity again. We need to increase the duration again. We need to add a new stimulus of some type. We need to add an extra day. And this is how we progress. This is how we get better. And this is how we can use HRV as a guide from the fitness standpoint. So the big thing as well I want to touch on, guys, is it doesn't have to be just a fitness thing. HRV is a big indicator of the nutrition we're putting into our body. Is it helping or is it not? And if it's not, and we're having a continual low HRV and we know we haven't been eating well, or we know something that we're eating has been causing us indigestion and we're seeing that low HRV, that's where we can take in a real true adjustment on it. Our sleep, again, I cannot stress how important sleep is. And we're going to get into those 4 stages and really do a whole one of these on sleep. But understanding that HRV will be a direct correlation to the quality of sleep that we're getting. If every other factor, if our training factor, if we're not stressed out, if our nutrition is on point, if our hydration's on point, if we've been doing everything from an immune system standpoint that we should be doing, it may be that we're not getting the quality of sleep that we need. If everything else is on point, something else is not here if we have a continual low HRV. So know that. And then here's a big one, guys, is immune function. How many of us would say, hey, I want to know if I'm going to be getting sick or if my immune system's compromised? HRV is a great indicator of that. If we've been doing the same type of exercise, if we are just in that maintenance mode, if everything else in our life is feeling pretty balanced, pretty homeostatic, then we need to take a look at what steps we can do from an immune system standpoint. Is it increase the tart cherry juice? Is it add the echinacea? Is it increase the vitamin C? Is it utilize some type of cayenne pepper to bring out the vitamin D within us? What aspects is it that we can do to increase that HRV? Because that is a sign that immune function is down, especially if everything else is on point. Mental health and stress, I mean, more now than ever, we are in the point of needing to make sure that that's on point. And chronic overload of the sympathetic nervous system, like we talked about at the beginning, is a major thing that a lot of us in the US and worldwide are facing. And so we need to understand that a chronic HRV depression is a sign of the effects that are going on with our mental health and that sympathetic overload. So utilizing things like meditation, journaling, deep breathing exercises, things that are going to help impact and, again, activate that parasympathetic nervous system will help us with that HRV. But now that you know what HRV is, what factors affect it, what to be aware of, and the applications you can take, thus now you can go and truly own it.